You are listening to Taming Alexander, Book 2 in the House of Otter series, written by Leo Sparx, narrated by Erotic, published by Horsemen Publishing Incorporated, copyright Leo Sparx 2020, all rights reserved. Chapter 1. Over a year ago, on the night I'd left Roderick in the rain, I didn't know where I was going. I only knew that if I was going to survive on my own, I needed to work. The boat launch became my new home. Near the brackish water, the boat launch was in a park where men would sit in their cars and wait for each other, where they'd cruise from the safety of their silver four-door sedans or baby blue SUVs until they saw someone they liked and ventured into the brush. I'd tried the bathhouse before that, loitering near the exterior of a place that marketed itself as a men-only gym, but didn't have any workout equipment inside. The pretense of waiting for my workout buddy in hopes a customer would invite me in to share his rented room was exhausting, but it was the only way inside without paying my own admission. Even getting a locker for a few hours was out of my price point as an initial investment to make a sale. Pacing circles at the boat launch park and weaving through the used condoms in the sand near where the mangroves met with the bay water had a much lower overhead. I could spiral from there to the parking lot half a dozen times, pretending I'd just arrived before Daddy would notice and follow me through the long green and brown shoots and stems. Once we found an open spot, I'd ask him if he was feeling generous, with doe-like eyes and a smile before I got to my knees in the wet sediment or bent over a pile of salty driftwood. He had to know the code first, that being generous meant he was willing to pay for quality head or sex from a professional. But once the formalities were out of the way, regardless of how the low tax of the park often matched the general look of the clientele, it was typically worth the constant charade to finally score a paying customer. Darius told me later, after I'd been in his house for a few months, that his approaching me at the boat launch hadn't been entirely selfless. Apparently, multiple men had complained about me lifting their wallets while they had their pants on the ground, and word traveled fast. He wasn't angry when he pulled me aside that summer evening in the park, but he was direct in letting me know I was giving the boys who were doing legitimate sex work in town a bad name and cutting into his business. I was lucky to encounter him before anyone else who wanted to point out my mistake. Instead of creating an enemy, Darius offered me a room and a job. He gave me a place to stay and a safe space to turn tricks. As I got to know my new roommates, Brent and Marco, the bleach blonde brothers from the north, and Sonny, the kid with the long wavy hair who only stayed awake long enough to take dick and paper money, I realized we had more in common than we didn't. We all had different stories for how we ended up in the house that Darius had somehow acquired. Even if the structure was falling apart and so filthy it could never be truly clean, it was more than most of us ever had as a shelter once we'd become adults. The stark contrast of my present surroundings in the House of Otter from my previous dwellings didn't escape me, even if the pleasantries from Usher seemed to be dwindling more with each passing day. When I received his most recent note, it was difficult to determine if he was angry with me. White briefs. Downstairs. Now, if this had just been a few afternoons before, and especially after using the secret passage without explicit permission, I would have been filled with anxiety that this sudden request would mean my dismissal from the house. But after the experience with the three of us together, bound to Roderick and taking Usher's spit inside of me, I felt more secure. Even if the notion was a coping mechanism on my part, it had all been so ceremonial. Something about the encounter made things seem more official, as if part of a ritual had been completed. Usher didn't have many words this evening. Upon my arrival in the room, he kept his back toward me, simply instructing that I sit on a black metal block and remove the briefs I had just been told to put on. Make up your mind, I thought, but didn't speak. My balls and bare ass were frosty upon the block as I watched him gather toys and whips on a table. Then wheel the giant wooden X, the one he had called a St. Andrew's cross, into the center of the room. I was seated to
Sample complete. Ready to continue?